Hey everybody, this is Mrs. Velasquez, and today I'm super excited to get started with one of our first flip lectures, which is looking at what does it mean to actually think like a historian. So for today's notes, what I would like you to do is make sure you have a designated notebook for your e-learning notes, whether it's a composition notebook or a section of your binder, spiral notebook. This would be a great tool since we'll be taking a majority of our lecture notes in this flip lecture format. Please keep in mind I'm not grading your notes, but definitely the notes will be used for assessments, for reading quizzes, for different unit exams. I would also strongly suggest that you check out the student resource folder. I posted some YouTube videos that talk about what are some ways you could use to organize your notes. For a lot of us, maybe you're still figuring out what works best for you. For myself, I always use Cornell Notes. I'm simple. I usually designate a left-hand column, take my notes on the right side, and then I put questions and bullets on the left-hand side. You might try the outline method. A lot of my slides usually have the title at the top, so that might be another way for you to organize and space out your notes. Whatever you do, you want to make sure that they're clean, make sure they're neat. And the very nice thing about the flip lecture format is if I talk too fast or you miss something, you literally could go back through, pause, rewind the video, and replay it again. All right, so I'm excited to get started, so let's start thinking like a historian. Now, beyond just the knowledge, the historical facts, and like I said, the discipline, the way of thinking, history also helps, I would say, making meaning of chaotic and, like the changing world we see around us. You turn on the news, and there's a lot of information, there's a lot of different perspectives, there's a lot of people and different groups presenting different ways of thinking. So I would say the best history engages students in the study of history, looking at the evidence for themselves, right? Looking at the artifacts, the documents. Sometimes when we look in history, right, they contradict. They sort of cross-reference. So if you sort of get into the sources, result of these experiences, that you'll be able to, once you look in the past, be able to sort of look at the bias, the perspective, and hopefully be less confused, ideally, with the world and the evidence you see today, right? Students are less likely to be confused with conflicting evidence of the world of spin, right? Spin, or, the one term we hear quite often is fake news, right? So many start to think in ways that a historian actually, David Fisher, would call if-then thinking. You don't need to know that name, but what he just basically says is he suggests that if we wish to make a better world that incorporates the best of the past with fewer mistakes, then we must explore what the past world looked like. So I always tell students as well, thinking about why history matters, is because the goal is to learn from the past so we don't repeat it, right? We take the successes and we build on them. The tragedies of the past, we try to prevent them from happening again. So that's kind of truly where we want to focus on as well. All right, so the last piece of just thinking about why history does matter. Everyone uses history. History education gives people tools, like I just said, to make better choices. I would argue too many people in the world today are historically ignorant. They don't realize the past. They don't take the time to look at the past. The world around us is fast-paced. It's changing. We have the new. We have the flashy. We have what's coming next. But I would argue there is some value to taking time to pause, to look backwards, to make better decisions forward. All right, history the way we should have learned it, or hopefully we will try to incorporate as we learn about history this year. So, excuse me, most likely in some cases, if people have a negative feeling towards history, like if they come up to me and say, oh, Mrs. Velasquez, history is just not my thing, it doesn't catch my attention, I'm more into, science or something more dynamic, something active, right? Because sometime in their experience, they just saw history as that indisputable, right? Just facts. People, places, dates, wars, and of course, like I said, the dates. That's like the one that stands out. So the problem with this vision of history that is just name, dates, and facts, it fundamentally kind of misrepresents what the discipline is. So history is not like a collecting something, you just don't collect it, right? Answering a history question is not like solving a chemistry problem either. History is unique. History, I would say, it's an active process. It's doing history. So you're not simply memorizing and sequencing facts. History should, in its true sense, be a discipline of inquiry and analysis. It's an active process of asking good questions about the past. A lot of our assignments, I'm going to ask you to ask questions, make observations, look at different sources and ask questions, finding and analyzing sources, and we'll talk about the different types of sources that we use. In history class, primarily, we look at primary sources as well as secondary sources. And then so once we look at those sources, then we draw our conclusions, right? If we're trying to solve a crime as a detective, we collect the evidence, we sort of lay it on the table, then we begin to recognize, okay, so the evidence is showing me this. This is the crime, this is who did it, so as detectives, we're trying to support that with evidence. But for some of us, that feels unnatural, right? Because history is perceived as that sort of old school, kind of just memorize name, dates, and facts. So I'm going to try to challenge you to think of it a little bit different perspective this year. Here we go. So kind of just reiterate the next slide. So reminder, I definitely want to get this down in your notes if you didn't catch it in that last slide. So I would definitely write down history is not the past, it is the study of the past. And I just gave that little example. Historians, really, we want to consider ourselves the detectives. We search, we compile, we sift to different types of evidence. And the type of evidence we primarily look at are primary and secondary sources. So historical evidence comes in these two forms. Now, secondary sources are comprised of information or explanations produced after the historical event by people who were not involved in the historical event. Secondary source information and explanations are usually based on primary sources and other secondary sources. So for example, the textbook that we'll be using this year, which is the impact textbook, that's a great example of a secondary source. You're going to find that the publisher put together the basic story or the basic narrative of these different time periods, but they've also incorporated different maps and charts and speeches, different primary sources in the textbook. Now, primary sources are comprised of the information or explanations produced at the time of the event or period, and usually by the people who are involved in that historical event. Secondary sources provide context. They give us like a little background, that kind of set the stage, the ideas, the information that are essential to understand the primary sources. So the historical detective kind of needs both. So for example, right now at the end of the semester, we'll study imperialism, which is again how Europeans took over and dominated parts of Africa. We'll read that chapter, we'll talk about that, we'll take some notes. At the same time, I want you to actually look at the different photographs, cartoons, pictures, speeches of what Europeans, again in this case, you can already ask some questions, make some observations of what is the message in this primary source over the domination of Africa. All right, so we'll be using both, and as thinking like a historian, my goal for you, of course, is to be able to identify whether it's a primary or a secondary source. All right, so what is the historical process? Like, how do we know what we know of the past? So some things to keep in mind, sort of the steps. So step one is always ask questions, right? Learning starts with questions. What happened? What's going on? Why were the people upset? What did the country do? Why would this happen? Where would this happen? So questions, 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 right? So if we're going to try to study a time period, a place, an event, then we dive into, okay, once we have a question posed, like a driving question, then we're going to start reaching out and to collect evidence. So we collect primary sources, we look at testimony, diary entries, newspapers, photographs, across the board primary evidence from that period we want to really understand. And then, of course, we also look at secondary sources because they also can give us the context, the backstory, kind of help us put the pieces together. And then finally, as a historian, the historian will need to look at this and then interpret it. In essence, kind of answer the question, well, this is what I see, this is what I've read, so my interpretation is this was a positive change, this was the beginning of the end, this was the most significant blank. So then we can sort of interpret. So when you pick up your history book, there already is an element of interpretation, right? Because in essence, that history book, when you click on the link and start reading the chapters, right, the publisher has already interpreted what is the most important part of World War II, or looking at the French Revolution, right? So that's part of the process. I want to at least introduce in this lecture also historical categories of inquiry. So kind of the questions, finding patterns and making sense of the past. There's a few I want to jot down in this case. So one of the probably go-to historical categories of inquiry is cause and effect. This is perhaps like the most familiar category of historical questioning and explanation. We ask questions about the causes and consequences of past events. So, not surprisingly, our answers to these questions, our historical interpretations, take the form of stories about causes and consequences. So here, you have to write all these down, but keep in mind, right, cause and effect. Who or what made change happen? Who supported change? Who did not support change? How did events affect people, lives, community? Those types of questions. Okay. Our second type of category I want you to think about is change and continuity. So we can also ask questions about what has changed and what has remained the same over time. A lot of students, when we start studying history, as much as we study about how things change over time, there's a lot of things that remain the same, which is interesting enough. So answers to questions about change and continuity connect events that give meaning to the chronological sequence of events. So what changed, what remained the same, who has and has not benefited from the change, something to think about. All right, and next category would be turning points in history. So in some cases, we wonder if the change was so dramatic that the topic of history was a historical turning point. So by studying that historical record, the evidence, we're able to kind of think about it and reach conclusions that some events or developments so dramatically changed a society's ideas, their choices, their ways of life, that some paths of development could no longer be followed and others became more likely or possible. So how did past decisions or actions affect the future? How did actions narrow choices for people? How did actions transform lives, for example? In some cases, we can look at the past as our guide to the present. So if we want to know about the particular course of events that shape the present, we are using the past, right, to seek guidance, to kind of look for the form, kind of like the lessons of history, like what's the moral, what's the lesson. And this can kind of help us kind of grapple or kind of like try to figure out a current problem. So like, how does the past help us make sense of the present? What can we learn from the past, right? So we improve upon it, we build on it, we don't repeat it, maybe example. Right, and the last one I want to present is the category which is through their eyes. I think most of us, we find it kind of like necessary and fascinating to examine the ways people from different times, places, and conditions, like how did they make sense of the world? How did they understand their world? When we consider how their experiences and their needs and their worldviews affected their actions and kind of the course of events. So we're trying to imagine what it's like through their eyes, right? Sort of walk in their shoes type of thinking. So how did the people in the past view their world, and how has the worldview changed their choices and actions? All right, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. So this just is a quick intro to sort of introducing